My grandma's last words were, "Check the back of the frames." I did, and I ran. My grandma gripped my hand tightly and whispered her final words before she died. "Look behind the frames." I thought she was hallucinating. But that same night, alone in her house, I obeyed. I turned over the picture frame that always sat on the mantel and found an envelope taped to the back with electrical tape. When I opened it, my hands trembled. Inside were photos, dates, signatures, receipts, and a filthy secret that involved my entire family. My grandma was the only one who ever treated me with dignity. After my mom died, I was raised like a burden. My dad remarried in under a year, and his new wife made sure to remind me every single day that I was the living proof of his biggest mistake. My room was in the basement. My plate was served last. My birthdays were ignored. Only my grandma cared. Only she would say, "One day they'll regret this." And right then, holding that envelope, I understood why. The most important document was hidden between the pages. The deed to a massive property in Vermont. But the name on the top made me fall to the floor. It wasn't my dad's, it wasn't my stepmother's, it was mine. Had been since I was 14, and my grandma had made sure everything was properly filed with the help of a trusted attorney. I had no idea. And now that truth gave me more than land. It gave me power. My name is Ashley, and I'm 26 years old. For a while, I was in shock. How had my grandma hidden this from everyone? And why go to such lengths to protect me? But then I remembered my dad had been trying to declare her mentally unfit in recent months. He claimed she was senile and wanted to place her in a private nursing home, even though she was completely lucid. Now I knew the real reason. He wanted the property. And my grandma, always sharp, had figured it out first. She just didn't have time to tell me everything. But she left clues, and I followed everyone. I stayed at her house for 3 days pretending to be in mourning. During that time, I combed through all her files, contacted her lawyer, confirmed the deed's authenticity, and legally transferred everything into a closed trust controlled solely by me. When my dad and stepmother showed up asking about the old country house, I feigned ignorance, told them Grandma had sold it to pay off debts. They bought it, no questions asked. That night, my dad stumbled into my room drunk and said, "You're not even worth what you eat." Your mother was the same. I stayed silent as always. But inside, something had already shifted. I was no longer the invisible orphan. I was the heir. And they had no idea. I knew one thing. Good revenge isn't announced. It's executed. And mine had just begun. Over the next few days, I gathered evidence. Old recordings, abusive remarks, even a hidden camera video where my stepmother said the only reason she hadn't poisoned me was because it's illegal. That house was packed with secrets. My grandma had left more than a deed. She left everything I needed to destroy the people who destroyed me. But what I found in the second frame, the one hanging by the staircase, nearly made me collapse from rage. And it sent me dialing a number I never thought I'd call. An old forgotten name, one that would change everything. I walked up the stairs with shaky knees, still clutching the envelope with the deed. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear my own footsteps. The frame by the staircase was ugly, old-fashioned, and always looked out of place. My grandma used to say she hated it, but never took it down. When I flipped it over, I found a false back. And inside it, a carefully folded piece of paper. Right in the center was a name I hadn't heard since I was 12. Mr. Whitaker, my old history teacher, who was abruptly fired after a scandal that never made sense. My dad was the one who demanded his dismissal, citing inappropriate conduct. But I remembered it clearly. That man never did anything wrong. He was kind, smart, and most importantly, protective. He stood up for me once and then disappeared from town. Back then, people said he had confessed, but it wasn't true. Folded with the paper was a flash drive and a note handwritten by my grandma. He tried to warn them. No one listened. Now you must. I rushed to my old laptop, booted it in offline mode, and opened the files. There were videos, audio recordings, and one secret video he'd made inside our house. The footage was grainy but clear enough. My dad and stepmother were scheming something. A voice said, "If she tells anyone, we'll ruin his career." The she was me. And what I was going to say, I still didn't fully know. But the recording made one thing clear. Something much bigger had happened. My dad had lied, manipulated, and destroyed the life of an innocent man just to protect himself and her. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a family revenge story. This was crime, coercion, and ruined reputations. And it all started with me. I went up to the attic and found my old memory box. Inside were my school notebooks, a diary I stopped writing after one particularly severe punishment, and the faint memory of a day I came home crying, clothes soaking wet. My mind, shielded by trauma, had buried so much. But now it was all crashing back. They silenced me, and Mr. Whitaker had tried to save me. I called the number my grandma had written on the back of the note. An older voice answered, hesitant. When I said my name, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Finally, your grandma promised me you'd call one day." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe 2 towns over. He still had documents and memories, and he was willing to testify. For the first time, I realized my grandma had built a protective web around me. And now that she was gone, she was handing me the tools to settle every score, every frame, every note, every forgotten name. It was all part of something bigger. And I was starting to see the picture. The cafe sat at the end of a quiet, nearly deserted street. I arrived early, took a seat by the window, and watched every car that passed. When Mr. Whitaker walked in, I knew it was him. Time had aged him, but the look in his eyes hadn't changed. He carried a metal briefcase locked with a padlock. He sat across from me, took a deep breath, and said, "Your grandmother trusted me, and I promised I'd protect you, even from afar." He placed the case on the table and unlocked it. Inside was a meticulous collection of folders, photographs, recordings, medical reports, and school records. All about me. But what shook me the most was a photo of me at 7 with bruises on my arm. I didn't remember that picture. Then he flipped it over. My grandma's handwriting, sent to the school in September. No one did a thing. His silence was suffocating. Every document proved what I'd been conditioned to forget. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. He told me he tried to report it, but my father had deep ties in town and everything got buried. His dismissal was the price he paid for trying to protect me. "They erased the evidence, but your grandma saved every copy," he said. And now it was in my hands. Every scrap of paper was fuel for my revenge. I left that cafe carrying the case like it was a bomb. And in many ways it was. I had everything I needed to expose my dad and stepmother publicly. But before I made a move, I had to make sure none of it could disappear. So I scanned every file, saved them in 3 encrypted backups, and sent a copy to my grandma's attorney. He replied within minutes, "We can file a lawsuit." Coming back home that night felt like walking through a minefield. My dad was watching TV. My stepmother was clipping her nails at the table. When I walked in, he barked, "Grab me a beer." I obeyed silently. They still thought I was the same girl, the unpaid maid, the house shadow. But I was about to blow everything up. The revenge was already in motion, and every word they spoke just tightened the noose around their own necks. That night, I was digging through the garage when I found something I never expected. Old boxes with my mother's name written in black marker. She died when I was a child, and they always told me it was a silly little accident. But inside those boxes were journals, photos, and a letter that was never sent, addressed to my grandma. The words were clear. "He's hurting me. I'm scared." That shattered whatever was left of my childhood. I grew up thinking my mom was weak, that she'd given up, that she just fell down the stairs and died. But she didn't. She tried to get help. She wrote she planned to leave, and someone silenced her before she could. My father killed the love of my life and then sat at the table with me every day like nothing had happened. Pain turned into rage, and rage turned into strategy. But among the old photos, one in particular stopped me cold because it showed something that never should have been there. I held the photo carefully, trying to understand why it felt so wrong. It was a simple image, my mom smiling by the fireplace, her hand resting on her belly. I wasn't born yet, but in the corner of the picture, barely visible with age, was a reflection in the mirror behind her. A man standing with his arms crossed, staring straight into the lens. It wasn't my dad, and it definitely wasn't someone she wanted around. I zoomed in digitally, adjusted the contrast and sharpness. My heart dropped. It was the same man who now works with my dad, his business partner at the construction company. Uncle Barry, the one who always showed up at barbecues. Back when that photo was taken, he wasn't a partner. He was a security guard at a psychiatric facility, the same one where my dad's ex-girlfriend had been forcibly committed. And now there he was in my mom's house before she died. That changed everything. I always thought the violence came solely from my dad, but there was a bigger network. They operated together, protected secrets, covered up crimes, and fed off everyone else's silence. Uncle Barry was more than an accomplice. He was the enforcer, the missing link my grandma tried to show me between the lines. She knew there was more than one monster, and she'd left me the puzzle pieces with surgical precision. I called my attorney again and set up an in-person meeting. I showed him the photo and explained everything I had uncovered. He listened carefully, taking notes on every name, every connection. Then he said, "This could reopen not one but two closed cases." My voice cracked. I could barely process it. My entire childhood had been built on deaths that were never investigated, but now they would be. At dinner, I tested my first trap. I casually placed the photo on the table and said, "Look at this one of Mom. I don't think I've seen it before." My dad froze for a second. My stepmother looked away, and Barry, sitting there like always, made a cold comment. She loved taking pictures by that mirror. Huh. The thing is, that mirror wasn't installed until after she died. I checked the original blueprints of the house. He'd just exposed himself. That was enough to trigger my next move. I turned on the voice recorder on my phone and hid it inside the fruit bowl in the kitchen. Then I started gently prodding. Casual comments, dumb questions, until from the bedroom I heard my dad say, "She's digging too much. Just like her mother. Thinks she's going to beat us." That was all I needed. Another recording, another noose tightening. I didn't sleep that night. I organized everything into a digital presentation. Images, audio files, documents. I sent it to 2 investigative journalists from the region. One replied in under 2 hours. "If this is real, it's the story of the decade." And it was. But I didn't want fame. I wanted justice. I wanted to see their eyes shake the way mine had for 20 years. And when the first subpoena arrived in the mail, my stepmother's face turned ghost white, and the mask she'd worn for decades finally started to crack. The letter came on a gray morning in a plain white envelope with the county seal. I already knew what it was, but I acted surprised. I handed it to my stepmother with steady hands. She opened it without a clue, and as she read, her eyes narrowed. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. My dad snatched the paper from her and, after reading, fell completely silent. For the first time in years, he had no comeback. The subpoena ordered both of them to testify about my mother's death and the abuse documented in school records. It was official. The case was being reopened as a criminal investigation. Barry had also been served and had disappeared from town. My grandma's lawyer called to let me know they were being watched. From now on, extra caution. They've got nothing left to lose. The tension at home became unbearable. My dad started drinking more. My stepmother, who used to humiliate me with every gesture, now spent her days switching moods. Aggressive, then sweet, then cold, like a cornered animal. But even cornered, she was dangerous. I began noticing things were being hidden. They whispered in hallways, locked doors, avoided answering calls around me. On Wednesday night, I pretended to go out for pizza. I circled the block and came back in through the garage. The kitchen door was cracked open. I heard my stepmother sobbing. "This is your fault, Mark. You said she was just a kid, that she'd forget." My dad hissed back low and broken. "You're the one who made everything disappear." "You wrote that damn letter." My knees buckled. Everything was unraveling. I went back upstairs as if nothing happened. But now I had another recording. I'd used the house's own alarm system to store the audio through the built-in mic at the front entrance, which they forgot to disable. The next morning, I sent the file to my attorney. He replied bluntly, "This is enough to file for first-degree murder." I read the message over and over. My mother's death had never had a name until now. Meanwhile, the press started to pick up momentum. The journalist I'd contacted asked for permission to publish an initial article. I agreed on one condition. My name had to stay out of it. That Sunday, the headline read, "Cold case from 20 years ago to be reopened. Businessman's ex-wife may have been murdered after reporting abuse." Social media exploded. And even though no one knew it was about me, the whole town was talking. When I sat down for dinner, they were pale. My dad was shaking. My stepmother cried for no reason. The silence broke when she screamed, "You don't know what you're doing! This is going to destroy the family." I stared deep into her eyes and said, "Family? The only family I ever had burned alive in her own pain. And you lit the match." They looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. But what I found in the basement closet behind a false wall took everything to the next level. Buried between rotting boards was the final secret my grandmother never got to tell me. I went down to the basement in the middle of the night following a vague childhood memory. My grandma once saying the house was built on a mistake. I never understood what she meant. But that night the phrase echoed in my head. I grabbed a flashlight and started tapping gently on the walls. At the back, behind the shelf of old cans, I heard a hollow sound. The wall was fake, and behind it there was a hidden space. It was a small compartment, damp and dark. Inside, a metal box covered with a sheet. The smell was old, moldy. When I opened it, I found what looked like a set of old case files sealed with police tape. My heart nearly stopped. The tape read, "Evidence, do not remove." Inside the box were crime scene photos of my mother's death, but these images had never appeared in the official file. In the photos, her body was positioned strangely, like she'd been dragged. The staircase was far too clean, and there was a bruise on her temple on the opposite side of where she supposedly fell. The original autopsy had been lost in the system, according to my dad. Now I knew it wasn't lost. It was hidden by him, and my grandma recovered it before he could destroy it. This wasn't just proof. It was a sentence. Among the papers was also a handwritten letter from my grandma addressed to me. "If you're reading this, it means you made it to the end. And now, my girl, do what I couldn't. Do it smart and without mercy," I cried, not out of pain, but strength for the courage of the woman who loved me in silence, for the chance to finally give them back everything they took from us. I grabbed the box and brought it straight to my lawyer, hand-delivered. He looked at me seriously and said, "This is enough to put both of them away for a long time." And that day, revenge took legal form. We filed a joint case. Homicide, obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and falsifying evidence. The warrants were issued. The judge signed off in record time. The police were already on the move. Meanwhile, inside the house, they were falling apart. My stepmother snapped over everything. She even tried to hit me when I didn't bring her coffee. My dad grabbed her by the shoulders, but it was too late. I had it all on video. Domestic violence, the cherry on top. The next day, I handed the footage over with the rest of the evidence. They were completely surrounded and had no idea who was behind it all. I was no longer the girl in the basement or the quiet orphan or the shadow. Though no one noticed, I was the heir to the truth, the granddaughter of the smartest woman this house had ever known. And now it was my turn to decide how the end would unfold. But when I heard the doorbell ring and the officer say my full name, I knew something had slipped out of my control because what she handed me wasn't a warrant. It was a warning straight from the district attorney's office. I opened the door with my heart pounding. The officer was stern but kind. She handed me a sealed envelope and simply said, "Read it carefully. It's important." I closed the door in silence and sat down on the living room floor, feeling something shift. The document was from the state prosecutor. It said that due to the contents of the evidence I had submitted, the case now involved a criminal protection network that could include public figures. In other words, my revenge had crossed the line from family dispute to state-level crime. The prosecution was taking over. A special task force had been assigned to protect witnesses, including me. The letter also warned that arrests could happen at any time, but I needed to be prepared for potential retaliation. That sent a chill through me. They knew. I locked every window, bolted the doors, hid the backup hard drives in 3 separate places, and disabled the GPS on my phone. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. If my dad had gone that far to bury the truth before, I couldn't imagine what he'd do now. My stepmother started acting even stranger, going through my things, asking where I was going. And one night, walking into my room without knocking, I woke up to her standing in the doorway holding my notebook. "What's this, Ashley?" she asked, her voice sickeningly sweet. I took it from her firmly. "Nothing that concerns you." She walked away slowly, but with hatred in her eyes. I knew I was on the edge. I had to leave. I messaged my attorney, and he suggested I temporarily stay with a social worker assigned to my case. I packed in silence. Didn't say a word to either of them. I left the house at 5 a.m., the sky still dark, my soul on fire. When I arrived at the new address, a secure townhouse in a quiet residential area, I cried for the first time in weeks. I slept with the doors locked from the inside and without fear of waking up to someone watching me. The house was small but full of peace, a brutal contrast to everything I'd lived through. 2 days later, I got a call. It was the lead prosecutor on the case. She wanted to meet me in person. "What you did, Ashley, isn't common. You didn't just survive. You built the kind of case that knocks down walls." We scheduled the meeting at her office. I walked in with my head held high. I told her everything, showed the documents, answered calmly. And when she finished listening, she said, "We're going to formally indict your father and your stepmother." I came home exhausted but at peace until I opened my email. There was an anonymous message, no subject, with one file attached, a photo of me taken through the kitchen window at my new address. And in the corner of the image, reflected in the glass, was the face of someone I never imagined would be involved. I opened the photo with frozen hands. It was clear. Me back-turned washing a mug at the place where I was supposed to be safe. Morning light was pouring through the window. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a coincidence. But when I zoomed in, there was no doubt. It was Josh, my cousin, the one who always seemed neutral. The one who used to say, "I stay out of family drama." Josh was the son of my stepmother's sister. We grew up together. He was one of the few who treated me kindly as a child. But after my mom died, he drifted away, moved out of town. He came back in recent years, saying he wanted to rebuild family ties. And like a fool, I believed him. He even took me to dinner a few months before my grandma passed. Told me he admired my strength. All lies. I pulled up my call logs. He'd called me days before the subpoenas were issued, asked how I was, where I was living. I answered vaguely, but apparently that was enough. The address was never made public. It had to have come from the inside, which meant someone in the prosecution had leaked it or someone close to me. Josh couldn't have known unless he'd been involved from the start. I contacted the investigator in charge of my protection, showed him the photo. Less than 2 hours later, he replied, "Josh is under investigation for money laundering tied to the family's construction company, and there's record of him meeting with Barry last week." That sealed it. Barry, Josh, my dad. The web was bigger than I thought, and my grandma had been right. The rot ran deep. I decided to act. I messaged Josh pretending I didn't know anything. Told him I needed to talk to someone from the family. He agreed immediately. On the day of the meeting, I was accompanied by an undercover agent. I hid a mic inside my necklace, sat with him, smiled, and let him talk. "You've gotten yourself into something you don't understand, Ash. You should have left it all alone." I recorded every word. As soon as he left the cafe, they grabbed him, caught in the act, witness intimidation and violating a protection order. I watched from a distance, heart racing, another piece down. Another part of my revenge realized they had gotten as far as breaching my safe space. But now they knew I wasn't prey anymore. I was the hunter. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I got home that night. The door slightly open, lights off, and footsteps upstairs. I froze at the entrance. The house was supposed to be empty. The social worker had left earlier and locked up, but now the doorknob hung loose like it had been forced. I stepped in quietly, phone in one hand, key gripped in the other. The lights were out, but the air carried a scent of perfume, not mine, and upstairs, the clear sound of footsteps on the old floorboards. I climbed each stair in silence, my heart pounding in my throat. At the top, I saw my bedroom door ajar, then a voice. "You dug this grave, Ashley." It was my father standing there holding an envelope. I don't know how he got in, but in that moment, everything made sense. The prosecution had moved too slowly. He knew he was going down, and he came to silence me first. "You destroyed this family. Your mother was sick. Your grandmother was paranoid. And you're the worst part of them." He said it with bloodshot eyes and a trembling voice. He was drunk, sweating. But he didn't touch me because he knew. One move and he'd be jailed. "You have no proof." He tried. I simply pointed to the camera in the ceiling corner. "You just gave me more." The police arrived in 4 minutes. I had discreetly triggered the emergency button on my security app. When they arrested him, he still tried to fight back, but it was too late. The warrant was active. The prosecutor showed up at the station herself to make sure he wouldn't get bail as he screamed that it was all lies from a bitter girl. I was signing paperwork for my new protected address. My stepmother was arrested hours later in another state. She tried to flee with suitcases full of shredded documents and cash. When she learned he'd been detained, she had a breakdown and confessed to part of the threats. The prosecutor called me. She's willing to cooperate, but she's trying to negotiate a lighter sentence. I made it clear I wasn't interested in deals. I wanted sentences. I wanted both of them where they left my mother cornered. In the days that followed, I moved again, still under protection. My grandma's lawyer began the official process to transfer the Vermont property to my name, now recognized as rightful inheritance. I started putting my life back together. I still had nightmares, still woke up sweating. But little by little, the pain gave way to something else. The certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. It was on one of those quieter nights that I found the final envelope from my grandma. It was tucked inside one of her books that I'd taken with me but never opened. A short note handwritten. Ashley, the truth always scares you first, but then it frees you. I always believed in you. Never forget who you are. But what came next in the morning papers proved the story wasn't over yet because someone from my mother's past was about to return. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. Messages, notifications, missed calls. My father's name was everywhere. Businessman arrested for murder and domestic abuse in decades-old investigation. But one headline made my blood run cold. Missing witness in cold case reemerges after viral story. I clicked. The photo at the bottom of the article showed a woman with gray hair and terrified eyes. The name hit me like a punch. Clarissa Monroe, my mother's best friend. She vanished right after my mom died. And for years, they claimed she'd run off because of debt. But now, 22 years later, she'd turned herself into the police in another state, saying she had always known too much. Clarissa said my mother had confided in her. Said she was being threatened, and that the night before her death, she called crying, saying, "If anything happens to me, it was him." She said she tried to report it, but was intimidated. A car followed her for weeks. After that, she dropped everything and fled, afraid she'd be next. Now that the case was reopened, she finally felt safe to come forward. Her statement was dynamite in court. It backed up my mother's letter, the photos, the hidden forensics, and most importantly, it destroyed any claims of an accident. My mother had been murdered. The prosecutor called me immediately. Ashley, the case is now irreversible. With Clarissa, we have both a witness and an emotional connection to everything and more. She says there was another accomplice, someone else present the night of the crime. My body froze. I thought the entire web had already been exposed. But there was still more, and this someone might still be out there, maybe even closer than I imagined. I went back to my mother's old diary. The pages were worn, ones I hadn't been strong enough to read before. I went line by line, and there, tucked among trembling words, I found the name she never said aloud, the same name Clarissa mentioned in her interview, Karen, the babysitter who looked after me at the time, the woman who disappeared right after my mother's death, who always seemed to know more than she let on, the one my grandmother never trusted. I went back through the records, tracked every trace of Karen. Her last name matched a woman currently working as a community counselor at a religious center 2 towns away. I switched to public image databases and found a recent photo. It was her, older, more disguised. But it was her. I knew. I sent it to the DA's office. The reply was clear. Don't do anything. We're going after her now. But I knew I couldn't just sit still. I took the car and drove there, parked outside the center and watched from a distance. When she stepped out to greet a group of teens, our eyes locked, and that's when I saw it. She recognized me, went pale, then ran back inside the building. That same night, a letter was slipped under my door. No signature, but 5 words that sent a chill down my spine. I know what I saw. I stared at the letter for a long time. The paper was thin, folded with precision. No name, no sender, just those 5 words. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, but the tone, it felt like someone begging or warning. I took the envelope to the prosecutor's office. They examined it carefully. It could be her trying to negotiate quietly or someone trying to silence Karen before she talks. The center where she worked was already under surveillance. The next day, she was discreetly taken in for questioning. According to the preliminary report, she denied everything. Claimed she never knew a thing. Said my mother seemed sad but normal. But when the prosecutor showed her the photos and excerpts from my mother's letter, her face changed. Her hands began to tremble. She asked for a glass of water, then a break, then a lawyer. 2 hours later, she confessed. On the day my mother died, she was called to the house outside her usual hours. My dad had asked her to stay with me while he took care of something upstairs. She heard yelling, then a loud thud. When she tried to go up, he stopped her. Said, "If you value your life, you'll never speak of this." And she didn't. For 22 years, she kept silent, eaten alive by guilt. Her confession sealed the case. With Clarissa's testimony, my grandmother's files, the rediscovered forensic reports, and now the babysitter's statement. The walls were closing in for good. The prosecutor called me. Ashley, we're recommending life in prison. The press wants to interview you. You have the right to tell your side. But I didn't want a spotlight. I wanted peace. I wanted to honor my mother, my grandmother, and the little girl I once was. Quietly. That night, I drove to the house in Vermont. The property my grandmother left me was still standing, surrounded by trees and silence. I sat on the porch, hugged one of her diaries, and let myself cry. For the first time, without fear of being heard, without fear of being hit for crying. For the first time, I cried freely, and there I began writing my own version of the story. Not for the papers, just for me. 2 months later, the trial began. I was called to testify. I walked into the courtroom with my eyes locked on the defendant. He tried to look back but looked away. For the first time, my father looked small. My stepmother beside him was pale and unrecognizable. When I finished my testimony, the room went silent. The judge took a deep breath and said, "Let's hear the next witness." And then a figure stood up at the back of the courtroom, a tall, thin man with gray hair. No one knew who he was. But when he spoke, my world flipped upside down. I'm a retired medical examiner, and I was directly ordered to alter the autopsy report of Ashley's mother. And the name he gave as the one behind that order wasn't my father's. It was someone even more powerful. The courtroom froze. The man adjusted his glasses, pulled a folded paper from his pocket, and handed it to the judge. It was a copy of the original autopsy report signed by him before the edits. It showed a fracture inconsistent with a fall, signs of struggle, and restraint marks on her wrists. The second report, the official one, had been falsified, and according to him, by order of someone not even sitting in the defendant's chair. "The name is Richard Sloan," he said. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Richard was the county prosecutor at the time, the one who shelved the case 2 decades ago, a name still active in local politics, influential, powerful. He'd done the favor for an old family friend. That friend, my paternal grandfather, a man everyone called honorable who died 10 years ago, but had helped cover up the murder of his own daughter-in-law. The prosecution requested an immediate suspension of the hearing. The case would now go federal. Corruption, bribery, tampering with public documents. The case I started out of personal revenge had become a historic investigation. My father and stepmother were only the beginning. I left the courthouse staggering, speechless. The world I thought I knew was rotted from the inside, and my family was the epicenter of the rot. I returned to my refuge in Vermont, where Clarissa was waiting. She had decided to move nearby to rebuild her life. We hugged in silence. There was nothing left to ask, only healing. She told me stories about my mom I'd never heard. How she danced around the house in colorful socks, laughed loudly when given cheap flowers, wrote hidden poems just for herself. That was the day I decided to create something new. I used part of my inheritance to open a foundation in my mother's and grandmother's names. An organization dedicated to helping women who are threatened inside their own homes. Each room in the foundation bears the name of a silenced woman. The central room, it's called Ashley. Not out of vanity, but to remind everyone that survivors don't just survive, they win. And they avenge. Months passed. The trial continued. The convictions rolled in. Prison sentences, resignations, headlines, interview requests I turned down. I never wanted fame, justice, and justice came. But one rainy afternoon, just when I thought everything was finally over, I found a brown envelope, no return address, quietly slipped under my welcome mat. Inside it, a single yellowed sheet, an old test, a DNA result, and the name listed under biological father wasn't Mark, the man I had called Dad all my life. I was in shock. The paper trembled in my hands. The font was old and the edges were faded, but the information was clear. The DNA test had been done months before my mother's death. And under biological father, it didn't list Mark, the man who raised me, hurt me, hunted me. The name there belonged to someone else, a name I'd never heard before. Ethan Caldwell. I sat down on the living room floor, the sheet in my lap, trying to process. Ethan, who was he? Why had my mother never told me? Was it a secret relationship? An attempt to escape Mark and start over? Or something even more tragic? The house was completely silent, like it was holding its breath with me. That revelation cast a new light over everything. Maybe my father knew. Maybe that was the real spark that started it all. I called Clarissa. When I said the name, she went quiet, then whispered, "Ashley, you need to come over." I rushed to her place in Vermont. She already had a box of old photos laid out on the table. She pulled out a folded picture. It was my mother, younger, smiling next to a tall man with brown hair and kind eyes. That's Ethan. They met in a night class at college. It was before everything. Clarissa explained that my mother had broken things off with Mark after finding out she was pregnant with someone else's child. She tried to tell him, but he lost it. Said she had humiliated him, that he would never raise another man's kid. That's when the obsession began, the threats, the surveillance, the forced reconciliation, the loss of friends, the prison that became her own home. My mother tried to run away with Ethan, but he vanished and was never seen again. With help from the Foundation's lawyer, we tracked down public records for Ethan Caldwell. He was still alive, living in a small village in Maine. I sent a letter, then a second. No answer until a week later, the phone rang. "I heard you were looking for me." "My name is Ethan, and I think I might be your father." His voice was deep, calm, and heavy with years of silence. We arranged to meet at a small cafe between our states. When I walked in, he stood up slowly, his eyes full of tears, his hands shaking. No words were said at first, just a hug, strong, long, steady. For the first time in my life, I felt someone hold me with no agenda, no control, no guilt. "I tried to find you," he whispered. "But they told me you'd been adopted by someone else. That your mother died in an accident." That's when he handed me a letter, aged, sealed with ribbon, written by my mother. "For Ashley, when she is free." But what she wrote inside that letter changed everything I thought I knew about the night she died. I held the letter like it was a piece of her. The envelope was yellowed, but still intact. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's soft strokes, the delicate curve on the A in Ashley. I opened it gently. The letter was dated 3 days before her death, and it began with a sentence that knocked the air out of my lungs. "If this letter reached you, it means I failed to escape." She told everything. How she met Ethan, how they fell in love, how she decided to tell Mark the truth, and how he reacted with violence. He locked me up for 3 days, no lights, no phone, and promised that if I ever tried to run again, I'd never see my daughter. The letter was desperate, but clear-headed. She had no hope of getting out alive. But she still hoped that one day I'd know the truth. She explained that my grandmother knew everything, but couldn't act without putting my life at risk. That's why the hidden notes, the stashed documents, the silent clues. My mother wrote, "If Ashley discovers all this, I need her to know." It wasn't weakness that silenced me. It was fear for her. Every line was a muffled scream echoing through the years to reach me. And then, at the end of the letter, she revealed the detail that changed everything. On the night she died, she had managed to write a second confession, a complete one with dates, places, names, even copies of receipts and transactions. She planned to hide this dossier where no one would ever think to look. Inside an old porcelain doll stored in the attic, the doll I'd always found creepy and never touched. I rushed back to Vermont, climbed up to my grandma's attic, and there it was. The porcelain doll with the faded burgundy dress. I pried it open with the tip of a knife, and the sound of paper tearing inside made my skin crawl. There it was, a bundle of folded pages wrapped in plastic. When I opened it, I found the full confession. What my mother couldn't say out loud, she had written in detail and signed. I sent the document to the DA's office. The impact was immediate. That confession written by the victim before her death was devastating. It left no room for accident claims or legal ambiguity. Ethan cried when he read it. "She tried to protect you until the end," he said. I replied, "And now it's my turn to protect her." For the first time, vengeance had become something bigger. It was justice and redemption. But that same night, when I returned to the foundation, I found the lights on, the doors unlocked, and a single sheet of paper on the conference room table. Handwritten in red ink, it said, "You thought this was over?" My body froze. That handwriting wasn't familiar. The red ink looked fresh, like it had been written just minutes before I walked in. The room was empty, but the air still carried the scent of cheap perfume, the same one my stepmother used to wear. I locked every door, checked the security cameras. Nothing. No alerts, no movement. But someone had been there, someone who knew where I was and wanted to remind me that something was still unfinished. I sent a picture of the note to the prosecutor. Within minutes, she replied, This feels personal and recent. The police were called. They swept the building, dusted for prints, but everything had been wiped clean. No solid leads except one. The paper used was the same kind from the notepad at the foundation's front desk, meaning they didn't bring the threat from outside. They wrote it here, inside, close. I gathered the whole staff and told them what had happened. 2 employees cried. 1 quit on the spot. Another said she'd seen a weird woman hanging around a few days before. I showed them old photos of my stepmother. She recognized her instantly. That was her, just with a blonde wig. The police now treated her as a potential fugitive. The prosecutor had no doubts. Even if she had been behind bars, she'd escaped or someone had helped her. That reopened a wound I thought had already healed. The woman who humiliated me, hurt me, and tried to erase my mother was still out there. And now she was taunting me. But what she didn't know was that I had changed. I wasn't the girl in the basement anymore, or the quiet orphan. I was the woman who flipped the script. And she had just messed with the last piece of memory I had left of the one who gave me life. That wasn't going to slide. I tightened the foundation security, hired a personal guard, and started digging through the prison's transfer records. That's when I found it. 3 days before her supposed move, there had been an emergency medical ID switch. The inmate who left the infirmary was never properly checked. She'd switched places with an accomplice and vanished. She had planned it all again, but this time she left traces. Nearby street cameras caught a woman matching her height and build entering a cheap motel 2 nights before the message appeared. And with her, a man, tall, built, with a scar on his arm, Barry, my father's old accomplice. It was clear now. The 2 of them had joined forces, and they were back to finish what they couldn't do 20 years ago. That night, while I was trying to piece everything together, I got an anonymous call. The voice was female, muffled. "If you open the garage gate now, you'll see what they left for you." And what I found in there wasn't a threat. It was a memory. One only my mother could have known. I slowly opened the garage gate, heart pounding. The cold light from the bulb exposed a plain brown box. No return address. I walked closer, cautiously. When I opened it, I lost my breath. Inside was a cassette tape, an old toy that only my mother and I knew about, a cloth bunny she had sewn herself, and a photo. Me, 4 years old, asleep in her lap. That picture was never taken by my father. This was personal. Deeply personal. The cassette had a label. Final recording. I took it to the player in the foundation's office and pressed play. My mother's voice came through, hurried, anxious. "Ashley, if this has reached you, it means things got worse. But if you're hearing this, it means you survived. So know this. I love you, and everything I did was to protect you. Truth has a price, but lying is dying slowly." The tape cut off right after. I cried, and for the last time, let that pain pour out freely. That was the goodbye I had been denied for 2 decades. It felt like in the end, she had broken the silence. The message was clear. Don't back down. Not even with them still out there. Not even with fear. The next morning, I took the box to the prosecutor's office. The tape was analyzed. It was authentic and more. My stepmother's voice came on in the final seconds, threatening my mother. That was the final proof. The operation was relaunched immediately. Barry was found first, trying to flee through New Hampshire. He resisted arrest, but was caught. With him, they found credit cards, fake IDs, and notes about me. My stepmother was found 2 days later in an isolated cabin, likely where they had been hiding. The prosecutor called me with a firm voice. She's in custody, and this time she's not getting out. The new trial moved fast, public, nationally televised. I was called to testify again, but this time I spoke as a free woman. I didn't ask for pity. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. How they made my mother disappear. How they tried to bury my grandmother's voice in silence. How they raised me in fear. And how I turned every piece of it into strength. The convictions were unanimous. Maximum sentence. No chance for appeal. I returned to Vermont a few days later, and for the first time did something symbolic. I buried the box, the tape, the photo, and the stitched bunny at the foot of a tree. I made a wooden plaque. Here lie truth and memory. Here begins freedom. It was my closure. Not because everything was fine, but because everything was brought to light. Today, I continue leading the foundation. I keep protecting women who are living what my mother lived. I changed my last name. I published a book with my grandmother's writings. And I know I still carry scars, but now they don't define me. They remind me of what I overcame, of what they overcame through me, of what no lie could erase. This is my story. A story of survival, truth, and justice. A story where the girl in the basement became the woman who brought down an empire of lies. And in the end, I didn't just survive, I won.